Welcome to the demo video for Sprint5 of the Searchworks Indexing and Performance Workcycle. Today we'll be going through what we've achieved in Sprint5, or the last week of work. Before we jump into that, I would like to mention who has been involved in this team. I am Christina Harlow. I'm the product owner for Searchworks Indexing and Performance Workcycle. We have Chris Beer as technical lead, Shelley Doljack, Jessie Keck, JRuby, and Winget as software engineers. Alissa Hafele and Sarah Seastone are involved as key stakeholders. Gary Geisler and Jennifer Vine. Primarily Jennifer Vine has been involved as a UX designer consultant. Stu Simon is our direct liaison, and Cam Chan is our ops superhero. So this is the demo video for Sprint5. I just want to introduce what we set out to try to achieve in Sprint5, or this 1 week sprint. Let me get down there. We wanted to try to wrap up a couple different things that we had gotten the majority of the work done, but that we hit all the hard parts. I think ship integration of stacks is a great example of side work that we needed to finish, and we keep finding beautiful unearthed gems of problems, but that's something we wanted to go on. For this work cycle, we wanted to try to wrap up the trajectification of our MARC and mods logic, and we'll have some discussion of the very hard logic we were left with mapping over, primarily around call numbers, which we talked a little bit about last time. When I say the trajectification, this is the actual mapping of, or the transformation of our mapping logic from one code base, SolrMARC, to another code base, Traject. Not the actual putting it into our production end-to-end indexing pipeline yet, which will be coming up more next week. So we wanted to get that done. That involved a fair amount of work for making sure that our data variances between SolrMARC and Traject were accounted for, and that's something we wrapped up. As well as getting some preliminary statuses for what kind of operational infrastructure we would need to run it. Something else we added this week, we do want to have an end-user monitoring app for our Searchworks indexing pipeline and Searchworks related components. That's something we've sort of punted on for the last couple of sprints, but we started a concerted effort to try to get a skeleton of a prototype up this week, and we'll be talking about that. And then we were working through our Searchworks super users feedback to address any problems that they found with actually moving the Searchworks index to an updated version of SolrMARC. So this is where we saw that there were variances because the SolrMARC code underneath of it changed, and we wanted to account for those before we moved to an updated version of SolrMARC. So that's something else we'll talk through today. That's an overview of our goals for this sprint. This point, I'm going to go back over here and start through our trajectification wrap-up, and it looks like the first person is Jessie.
You can get into the channel then.
Yeah. All right. And you're going to share your screen, I believe?
I am going to do that.
Rad, yay. To give us the saga of call numbers and item display fields, which is quite the epic. We need like a roaring fire to sit around while we talk about this.
Well, this one's specific. Okay. All right, so I want to talk today about what I'm showing on the screen here. It may be incomprehensible, and you're right. This is a particular field that we have that's kind of representative of a lot of data that we've been spending some time over the last 2 weeks or so working on converting. And this is how we do a couple things. One, display holdings in both search results and the record view. So this is how this data is more or less encoded in SolrMARC for us to be pulled out into the application, as well as something that you can see here, which is where the data gets really interesting, that I will highlight, which I'm not sure how well that shows up in the recording, but these things with lots of tildes and strange characters, which are actually forward and reverse sorting keys. So this does things like allow us to sort call numbers, or attempt to sort call numbers in the record display for within the location so that it's in the right order. It's not necessarily in the right order in the record, or when it comes to us it might not be in the right order, and it doesn't just sort, computer doesn't sort call numbers naturally. So this is an attempt to create a key that a computer can sort a call number naturally on. So not only that, we also use these keys to drive our browse by call number feature. So both in the record when we have an embedded call number browse, which I will actually kind of poke over and show, and also when we jump into the full page here. So all of this is more or less driven underneath by those keys so that we can, so Solr can actually respond with documents as they would appear to be on the shelf in call number order. So as I mentioned, in addition to that feature, this entire kind of display here with the call numbers and even how when we click onto the request link, which barcodes are associated with what call number is all encoded in this particular field here. So we spent a lot of time mapping this over, and I will just say the shelf keys, the forward keys and the reverse keys ended up being, and particularly the edge cases around them, ended up being pretty complicated and pretty complex for us to go through. We took a lot of time to look over existing data and take the code that we had now generating these things and check against them. And I think in a lot of cases we've been able to make some potentially probably transparent but improvements to how this was being handled underneath the hood, incidentally and on accident. The other thing, some other stuff that was ported over with this is, in addition to the shelf keys, was a notion of a preferred barcode, and we used that to try to figure out what the right thing to do again in browse is, because a particular item can have multiple call numbers, multiple kinds of call numbers, kind of DUI and LC in the same record. So there was some algorithm to try to pick what a preferred barcode out that we would try to jump into or display in certain places around the app, and so that ended up being some complex logic that was also ported over. So we have this now in our, so that was actually just production data because that was easier for me to find a big nasty example off the top of my head. But here in, this is an index that we're writing from the new Traject code, and you can see we've got nasty things with tildes in them too.
Yay, parody.
Anything about some of the improvements we've made to our ability to parse, especially DUI call numbers?
Yeah, so incidentally, while we were moving some of this code over and testing it against existing functionality, we did notice some improvements in one of the particular ones that I believe Chris is mentioning. Is we have a DUI collection in the education library that's like a textbook collection. That before I think we were kind of bailing out and we wouldn't show what those things would logically be in the DUI collection if they were shelved by their call number, and we were able to actually identify those and parse them appropriately as DUI call numbers. So with the hopes that those books will actually now get browsed and show up in the browse where they weren't before. And we've made kind of various other minor improvements that I'm going to guess you probably wouldn't notice in our collection because you would have had to have had certain sets of call numbers, but just across the board for LC and DUI, we've made some improvements to how really complex call numbers would have been handled if they existed in our system.
Great, thank you for showing that. And that represents a ton of logical work. One of the trickiest things about this work cycle is we are aiming for data parity because we aren't trying to improve the mapping to just get it to a new system operationally, but you have these kind of edge cases where it's hard because we uncover bugs or we're like, well, we have to rewrite a ton of logic anyways, can we fix this? So, thanks. All right, next, Jack, you're gonna take over and talk some more about course reserves, deletes, and then possibly the new VMs?
Yeah.
Cool. Do you want to share your screen or?
Yeah, sure.
Brad.
So one thing to note is we had this long-running ticket around finishing course reserves and deletes. And previously, the course reserves were handled through a separate code base. Through the past several weeks, we were able to move and finish moving all of the logic from the course reserves code base into the Searchworks Traject indexing code base. So this was finalized over last week, as well as deletes. Deletes were also handled a couple different ways, and we were able to, I think, consolidate kind of the delete logic as well. One thing to note is we've came last week finished setting up our production machines, and last week we were able to start deploying our indexing code to the new production machines, as well as start to run several indexing runs on these production machines. So there's not maybe much to demo here, except we've started getting some preliminary benchmarks on the production machines, and we're actually seeing some new issues arise. So we've been diagnosing these new issues that have arisen, trying to figure out where the bottlenecks and bugs are. Most notably, we're hitting HTTP ceiling thresholds now for Solr, which is a good thing because we're maximizing our indexing performance. So we're now having to actually throttle that down a little bit so we don't overwhelm the Solr server. So that's kind of the latest updates on course reserves, deletes, and our new production games.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. And now I'm going to hand it off to Chris and Alyssa to talk about the data differences review. Chris, are you going to? Yep.
I'll start sharing and then hand it over.
Ooh, nice colors.
So if you remember last week or 2 weeks ago, I reported on our efforts to compare output between SolrMARC and Traject, and we were looking at something a little under 1% variation between the code bases. I'm glad to report after much work by the team and an important decision we got from one of the Griffin Search committees about the importance of white space. We've been able to take that down to about 0.01% variation. Sorry, 0.0001% variation, which is great. We have about 750 documents that are indexing differently, excluding call numbers and item display, which is a special case. We have what the team did is we have a report out of our testing tool that just tells us there are differences. It's very verbose and ugly and difficult to manage. Fortunately, now that there are 750 documents, it's something that you can actually consider approaching. And we're happy to hand that off to Alyssa.
If you just click on the link in the agenda. So what we did was we took Chris's reports here and output the lines of interest into a spreadsheet so that we could review the data. And as you mentioned, there are about 650 keys, lots of lines, lots of rows, and started to see there were a good amount of similar things being reported and a lot of obvious data-related problems, so mostly stemming from poor vendor metadata. So it was pretty straightforward to get through the entire list. And we narrowed it down to a handful to review, and from that there are just, I think, 2 or 3 that need additional analysis before we can confirm that the difference is acceptable. So I think everything really, for the most part, looks good. It can either be attributed to a data error or something like we have an explanation for the difference. And I will note that there was a good amount of things that were an improvement from how we handled SolrMARC
Great, yeah. All right, anything else, Chris? All right, thank you for that. So we can start, we can feel more confident in our Traject pipeline, which is great. The next thing we're going to review is efforts to recreate or improve the data control report that tends to come out of the indexing pipeline. We're moving that to a step before, and I'm going to pass that off to Shelley. Shelley, do you want to share your screen? Or?
Yeah, yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so as Christina said, we used to report on we currently report on some of these errors in indexing, such as records that have multiple 245 fields or multiple fields for a main author. And in the Traject pipeline, we wouldn't be reporting these as errors out of the Traject pipeline. So I've recreated some of these reports using Cersei Dynix's Blue Cloud Analytics product. And so you could see here, there's like 7 different reports that report out some of the same things that we currently get with SolrMARC. And just to show you what one of these would look like, it would be just an email that data control would receive of records that would have multiple 245 fields, and it outputs the catalog ID and the tag number and what the subfield data is that's been repeated. And this is an example of one for multiple 1xx fields. And that's pretty much all I have to say about that.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for that. And it's a really helpful step because we will still have monitoring, but it's more developer focused for the Traject pipeline. This is going to be really focused on the data issues specific for discovery. So you don't get all of this developer output along with there's a repeated field. So that looks really awesome. Thanks, Shelley. Okay, so now we're going to move on to, hold on. Someone say something? No. We're going to move on to the skeleton of what we have named Searchworks Status, which is our end-user monitoring app. Drew or Camille, which one of you guys? Yep, Drew. Cool. Perfect. Thank you.
So this is a dashboard that combines some of the resources that we've developed to read out the status of Searchworks indexing and the app itself. So one challenge is that although we knew the questions that users wanted answered, we didn't always have the data or necessarily the operational procedures to support answering all questions perfectly. So what we've put together here is what we have that we can reliably show people. So these are the health checks that we've already put up on various servers, and the dashboard is going out and retrieving that information and parsing it and displaying it here. And then below that we have graphs from New Relic that are just embedded with custom titles for the Searchworks main app page load time. So for example, users might like to see spikes like this if they're experiencing a performance issue, to know whether the current issue they're experiencing is normal or how it compares to regular performance. And then we have the Solr response time, which is useful for knowing when for where a problem might be coming from. And then supplementary services like EBSCO can also be displayed here, so we know if external endpoints are causing problems. This has all been put online, and at the moment we're deploying this just using GitHub pages, and we're exploring other ways to do that if necessary. And it's set up in a way that's fairly configurable. If we need to add more endpoints or graphs, we can just do that in this one file here, similar to setting up a an internationalization file or something of that kind. That's where we are.
Great, thank you. And just to confirm, those endpoints are checking, is this thing actually responding? And if so, it gives it a thumbs up, and if not,
Right.
it gives it a question mark. No.
More or less.
Cool, great. So that looks good, and we'll continue to see how we build it out. And then the last thing we want to talk about today is, as part of our move of the Searchworks index to use SUL-Solr, our instance of Solr Cloud, and Solr 7, we spent the last sprint going through our Superusers review. So as a reminder, we talked about this a little bit last time, but we know that when we moved Solr versions, the underlying code changes in ways that might affect relevancy, even though we don't change any of our configs. And so we wanted to have, we can generate all of the analytics on what quantitatively has changed, but we needed a qualitative review. And we asked a bunch of people, some of the folks in this room, to do a check for us to make sure it still looks okay. They did that. We had about 71 issues reported back, some of which were just, this looks fine. So a lot of them were thumbs up. But we did identify a couple areas that we want to go through now and talk about how we addressed, so that we can continue on with this progression towards Solr 7. So Chris, do you want to go first?
Sure. The area I'm going to talk about is in our handling of CJK full text searches. Leading up to the review by the Superusers, the team worked closely with Vitus to try to understand some of the issues, and through the Superusers review, a few more were uncovered, particularly around handling traditional and simplified Japanese words or characters, handling alternate variants in the way CJK characters can be displayed, and in simplified and traditional forms of Chinese characters in Japanese texts. Some of these were fairly easy to deal with. We made a mistake when we upgraded Solr. We had a traditional to simplified mapping that was happening in the right place, but we failed to bring the katakana to hiragana mapping up with it. The other thing we had to do in the sprint to help address some of these issues, particularly this byte-to-byte string, is it turns out the second character on this string is actually a variant of another character. And at Stanford, back when we first did this CJK work, we developed our own mappings for these variant characters. So we have like several thousand mappings of character to character variants. And we need this information in order to have our filter correctly identify Chinese and Japanese words. Because when it can do that, it can break into the appropriate unigram, bigram, trigram, quadgram terms that we need to power search. So we did some work to adapt the existing work into something compatible with the new dictionary-based splitting that we've mentioned the last couple weeks. And it seems like it's working fairly well now. There's a couple outstanding questions about how some words are being bigrammed or trigrammed, and just clarifying whether that is the right thing to happen or something we will need to address in the future. It's a second thing we addressed, and I think I've lost the ticket, is there was a question about names with hyphens in it, and it was, here we are. An interesting one where a search for a name without any diacritics retrieves 34 results, but as soon as you add an appropriate apostrophe or apostrophe-like character in the middle of the string, you were only getting 4 results. And we were able to do some work, identify it as an interesting artifact of the way we split words. in the new version of Solr, and we were able to deal with that as well.
Great. Great. All right. And then the last thing we wanted to talk about with that was, yeah, confirming Boolean search functionalities. And it looks like Jack, do you want to talk about that? Do you want to share anything? Cool.
Oh, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Great. So this was a ticket, and there wasn't actually just it's interesting. I think there wasn't actually anything for us to change this week, but just to confirm what the super users were seeing, and then do some research on based off their feedback and provide more context and understanding. And this question was about Boolean and star searches. So asterisk searches. And so basically, long story short, we determined that Boolean searching appears to be similar to the previous Solr versions and is working, as well as the asterisk search as well. So there's a little bit different results, but the Boolean part and asterisk are working similarly.
Yeah, and I would add that the big question there was, we're not sure if some of these were changing because Boolean searching was being treated differently, or something else was being treated differently and it just happened to be a Boolean search. So we wanted to be super explicit to be like, we check this, the Boolean part is fine, make sure we document it so we all know that going forward. So that's great. Anything else, Jack?
Oh, one thing to note, I just, an additional piece of information that I didn't know before doing this was, because our default search is search terms we use is and, using an and in the search or not using an and in the search actually will return the same results for a multi-phrase or search. So I thought that was interesting, something I learned.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. All right. And so that is our demo video for Sprint 5. We'll be having planning first thing tomorrow to see what we want to try to do in Sprint 6. I imagine a lot of this is the productionizing of moving this forward. So how do we actually start getting it to where you'll start seeing it in production? And continuing to move along on the end user apps and the Solr upgrades that we know are coming down the pipe. So if you have questions, comments, or issues, you can leave a comment in the comments below this YouTube video, or you can find one of us, email us, find us on Slack, talk to us in the hallway. And that's it. Thanks.